Happy Labor Day. Did you know that Labor Day didn't begin with barbecues and mattress sales for some reason? And it didn't start as a gift to workers, but as damage control. In 1894, President Grover Cleveland was desperate to calm the nation's anger over the Pullman strike that shut down railroads across the Midwest. Workers who could barely feed their families on salaries already went on strike when the company tried to squeeze even more rent in their company-owned housing. And as usual, the government sent in troops to break the strike. Violence erupted, and dozens were killed. 6 days after the strike, Congress hurried through a bill declaring a new national holiday, Happy Labor Day. The 1800s were full of labor unrest. I didn't know this, but interestingly, more than 37,000 strikes in 25 years, disrupting railroads, mines, and factories. And most governors reach for the same answer. You call in the militia, you crush the protest, and restore order. Now, Colorado had one rare exception. So Governor Davis Waite believed government should serve the people, not just the interests of the mine owners and railroad barons. And so when the Cripple Creek miners struck in 1894 for an 8-hour day, mine owners demanded he send in the state militia. And he did. But to keep the peace, not to enforce their will. And the owners backed down. And it was the only successful strike in Colorado's bloody history, all encouraged by a Denver pastor who saw the struggle of the workers as the very heart of the gospel. So Denver had grown quickly from a dusty mining camp built almost overnight in 1858 into a bustling hub of railroads and smelters. New mansions rose on Capitol Hill with gleaming marble staircases and stained glass windows announcing their wealth. And in 1875, First Congregational Church looked for a new pastor. And for those who don't know, Mission Hills is part of this congregational tradition. So the church leaders sought someone cultured and educated to match the city's aspirations. And Myron Reed fit the bill. Oberlin trained, well-read, eloquent. The congregation hired him, and they thrived. And in 1881, among those mansions, they built a grand stone sanctuary, seating nearly 900. It was one of Denver's proudest and most respectable institutions. And 2 years later, he preached a sermon. Lit a fire. So Denver's newspapers had been constantly warning of a new menace. The tramp, they called them. Men without steady work, sleeping when necessary in boxcars, painted as criminals and a threat to their prosperity. And the cry was for vagrancy laws and more police, more prisons. So it was in the midst of this context that city papers often published sermon titles for the next day. And so one Saturday, readers of the Rocky Mountain News saw the title at First Congregational. The evolution of the tramp. And the next morning, curious worshipers filled the sanctuary, wondering whether Reed would also echo the law and order sermons from other respectable pulpits. But instead, he declared that the tramp was the product of an unjust society. Not a villain, but a victim. Industrial capitalism, he said, had created surplus men. Railroads discarded them when no longer needed. Mines boomed and just as quickly went bust. Where did those workers go? Where did they go when they were old or broken? The tramp, Reed thundered, is the child of our system, not his own sin. This was this rising social gospel at the time confronting Gilded Age excess, as I spoke of last week. He was a contemporary with Washington Gladden and Columbus and Walter Rauschenbusch. And so, believe it or not, the newspaper reported on a sermon, and now the entire city heard Reed's indictment, and various newspapers scolded him for excusing criminal vagrants. And the business elite fumed, but workers heard a minister describe their lives honestly. And they began calling Reed the laborer's chaplain. And there's one more interesting thing, it's kind of an aside, but I'd like to share about Myron Reed. So in 1887, he and 3 other clergy co-founded what was called the Charity Organization Society of Denver. They needed somebody to come up with a better name, but in the end, what it was the nation's first federated community fund. So which means instead of every charity knocking on doors separately, they raised and pooled their resources into one fund and distributed it more efficiently and fairly to families in need. And you may not know, this was the beginning of the United Way, which officially recognizes Reed and their efforts as their founding, which you can see why I thought was an interesting tidbit to add. But so the evolution of the tramp became a defining moment of Reed's ministry. And after the sermon, workers began filling the pews of his church, while some of the members with those stone mansions on the same block started slipping quietly out the back. And it was an illustration of today's gospel lesson, right? Jesus went to eat at the home of the Pharisees, a Pharisee, and he watched the guests scramble for the best seats and told the parable that when you're invited, don't take the place of honor. Sit instead at the lowest place, for all who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who humble themselves will be lifted up. And then went further, when you give a banquet, don't invite your friends or your rich neighbors, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. And from Reed's pulpit, that parable comes to life. The tramp, the miner, they were not intruders, but they were the honored guests. And not a nuisance to be jailed, but a neighbor to be loved. And more powerfully, they are a living sign of what happens when society forgets justice. And that is exactly what Jeremiah and other prophets before him kept saying, century after century. Stop crushing the poor, stop hoarding wealth, and stop pretending worship can cover over injustice. But the warnings went unheeded, and Jeremiah warned, this path can only end one way. And finally it did. In 587 BC, Babylon swept through Jerusalem, tore down the walls, burned the temple, and carried the people off into exile. And imagine being marched past the rubble of your city, the courthouse, the library, everything gone. And imagine seeing your own church burned to the ground, your sanctuary in ruins. Imagine trying to teach your children songs of God while your neighbors are mocking you for singing at all. Psalm 137 says it so powerfully. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Our captors demanded songs, but how can we sing the Lord's song in such a strange land? So for those dragged into Babylon, Jeremiah made a promise that cut against everything they could see with their own eyes. The temple that held God's presence was ash. The king who claimed David's throne was in chains. Priests had no altar, prophets no city to speak to. Every visible sign of God's covenant was gone, and Jeremiah dared to say, the covenant is still alive. It's just not on stone that can be shattered, or scrolls that can be burned, or not in institutions that can collapse. It is written where no one can take it from you. It is written on your heart, on the human heart. And that word gave the exiles something to carry when they had nothing left. And I don't think it was as much comfort as it was defiance. You are still God's people, and the future is not finished. And that's why, I think, Jeremiah still matters. Exile. Exile's not only their story. Exile belongs to anyone who finds their home itself turned foreign, who wakes up a stranger, for example, in their own nation. Kind of where I find myself, a stranger in our country, while behind the scenes it changes into something that distorts its promise. Unrecognizable. Some of it not behind the scenes, this week alone. National Guard units federalized to occupy and intimidate Washington, D.C. with threats for more. Chicago, New York, and beyond. We've seen public servants purged from their jobs, experts in their fields removed not for incompetence but for refusing blind loyalty, and public health be damned. We watch helplessly as our own history at the Smithsonian is stripped of Black, Latino, and queer stories. And I wonder, are we entering into a time of exile? Exile for those who still hold faith in a government of the people and by the people and for all of the people. Foundations of a democracy are crumbling into rubble every day, and Jeremiah dares to say to us, we are still God's people, and the future isn't finished. And I'm wondering if exile might be a hopeful or a helpful theological framework for feeling powerless when your nation disintegrates, frightened, lost, for what it feels like to have your songs stolen, and whispering with the psalmist, how can we sing the Lord's song in such a strange land? In exile, when everything else is stripped away, God gives what cannot be taken. And it's not comfort that dulls the pain. It's a claim that no despair will ever sink us so low that we ignore the cries of our neighbors. To never arrive at the point where we ask, why bother caring anyway? Caring, for example, neighbors like Martha and her children in Queens. They fled violence in Ecuador in 2022 and earlier this month did what the law required of them. They showed up for a routine immigration check-in and were, like others with troubling regularity, detained instead. And within days, Martha and her 6-year-old daughter were sent to a detention center in Texas, while her 19-year-old son Manuel was sent to a detention center in Newark, locked away like he was a criminal, and the mother and sister deported to Ecuador. And 2 more children remaining in Queens, including a 16-year-old daughter, now carrying the weight of a family scattered across 3 states and 2 countries. And so I'm saying exile's not an ancient history, and it's not a metaphor. It's exile. This is exile with names and faces. Gilmar Abrego Garcia threatened now with exile in Uganda, a country he's never known, where he's no family, no language, and a country chosen only because of how absurdly cruel it is. First mistakenly detained and thrown into a Salvadoran prison known for torture, brought home and reunited only to be torn away from his family again. Exile upon exile. But exile's not only about headlines and nations. I want to suggest that exile is also personal. Exile is when someone you love dies. And suddenly the place that once felt like home feels foreign. Because their chair is empty, their voice is missing, and you find yourself a stranger in your own life. An exile is when the doctor says cancer, and your very body feels like strange land. I mean, it's familiar, but it's no longer safe. And it's carrying you where you never wanted to go. An exile is when a friendship shatters, or work that gave you meaning is stripped away, or from which you retired. Who am I now? Exiles when you sit by the rivers of Babylon in your own soul and ask, how did this happen? How can I keep faith in a place like this? But if we're going to live in exile, as if we have a choice, feeling exiled in a nation that forgets its promise, or alone in homes touched by death, or estranged in bodies that betray us, well, even still, exile's not the final word. Exile's that space in between. It's a place where we can become what is next. As you think about it, exile can strip us bare, take everything away, but it can also teach us what matters most and get us on the right track. Exile can be a school, right, where we learn endurance and compassion and the strength of standing together. We don't have to think like we're victims. Let's embrace exile and join Jeremiah's invitation to live into this defiant hope, and to remember songs will rise and justice will come and our land shall be made whole again, even more proudly diverse, equitable, and inclusive than before. Jeremiah dared his people and dares us to hold on, because we are still God's people, and our world may be crumbling around us, but God isn't finished yet. God isn't finished with you yet. And if you're not sure you can hold on to that, it's written on your heart.